today. You and I have met periodically over the last couple of years, and we have a lot of conversations around animal assisted and my concept of working animal assisted as it relates to DBR therapy, which we'll chat about a little bit later. But my theory is we probably have about 3 different types of listeners with us today, or at least when they're going to be watching the recording in a later time. Folks that maybe have never heard of DBR therapy, or maybe have had some curiosity about it and are considering getting trained in DBR. So that population. We might even have folks who are trained in DBR, maybe more recently or even more seasoned. And then the third category of folks are going to be people that are incorporating animal assisted interactions in their work. Of course, that's something that is near and dear to my heart. So there'll probably be a population of folks who may not be DBR trained or might be, but have an animal assisted interest. So I wanted to have a conversation with you that can help all 3 populations that might be listening today and just kind of see where it takes us. What I love about our chats is usually we start here and then it goes these really fun threads. So overall, could you just give, and I say this kind of jokingly, a brief, and what I mean by brief is, how could you say DBR therapy? How could you give a description of what DBR therapy is for people who are not trained in it and might be curious about what DBR therapy is and maybe some of the underlying theory that drives it?
Okay, so DBR, deep brain reorienting, is a trauma psychotherapy that developed out of a need to help people to process traumatic experiences without being overwhelmed by them. And there are many effective trauma psychotherapies
Sure.
available, but I was always concerned that the people with the most severe disorders, the complex PTSD, dissociative subtype, for example, were the hardest to work with because with standard approaches, they were most likely to be overwhelmed. So I've arrived at DBR, which I have found to be a way of um, working with traumatic experiences that is less likely to be overwhelming. Now, that's not to say that it is never overwhelming, so
Yeah.
it's really important that people are trained trauma psychotherapists, that they have a good experience of trauma and dissociation before they start using DBR, because all trauma therapies are unpredictable, and it's really important that people have a background and experience in trauma therapy and use this carefully.
Mhm. So one of the things I loved about what you shared is how you saw a need with folks that have complex traumatization, that they were really getting overwhelmed in therapy. Could you maybe speak a little bit about how DBR specifically, there's a greater capacity of clients to be able to process with DBR and not get overwhelmed in terms of our theory of why that is with DBR?
And the surprising thing to me was that what we call the orienting tension has proved to be a good anchor for processing.
Yes.
And often, if we use, for example, a recent day trigger or activating stimulus, and we get the orienting tension, then we're able to process without overwhelm.
Mhm.
And for people that don't know the background to this,
Please.
my interest had mainly been in the midbrain periaqueductal grey, the area that's responsible largely for defensive
Mhm.
responses and basic affects or
Mhm.
emotions. Um, but working with colleagues to help them understand trauma responses that had been stuck, I began to pay more attention to the superior colliculi, the area of the midbrain that's involved in the immediate response to a stimulus, and therefore is involved in orienting to that stimulus. So if we see something horrific, as soon as our attention goes to that thing that's horrific, the superior colliculus or colliculi in the plural, that gets activated. And what we found is that there is then an immediate tension in the muscles of the forehead, around the eyes, or at the base of the skull.
Mhm.
And that's what we call orienting tension because it's an immediate muscle tension that precedes any eye movements, head movements,
Mhm.
or other movements.
Mhm.
And we got confirmation of that from studies that were done some years ago now on monkeys when they covertly attended to something.
Mhm.
There was a tension in the muscles, deep muscles at the base of the skull.
Mhm. You know, it's interesting as you're sharing that. I was getting this internal experience of the imagery of uh, interacting with horses for a long time. How there's a moment, there's a moment we kind of talk about horsemanship before what happens. And let's say a typical PAG response of an animal, let's say a horse might be a flight response in terms of getting away from something. But there is that millisecond of a moment where you actually can see, we call it their axis pull joint, where you can actually see a tension that comes in the neck. And
Uh,
there's a very subtle eye movement. And that's what came to mind when you were sharing that. And it strikes me that in our therapeutic process before having DBR therapy, how we might miss that and not even know what that is.
yeah, and I missed it for years, so
Mm,
that's why I'm still surprised at how important that immediate orienting tension is.
mhm,
And it comes in the animal studies at the base of the skull, the deep muscles of the neck at the
mhm,
base of the skull. But we've also found in humans that the muscles of the forehead and around
mhm,
the eyes are,
mhm.
are important and often come in as the orienting tension.
I remember when I first got trained in DBR therapy, when you would speak about that, it would seem almost impossible to conceptualize that being holding an awareness of an orienting tension would be enough to keep one in the capacity to be able to be with what one is actually getting in touch with. And I would dare say it was even shocking for me in working with complex
Mm.
trauma, how, like, again, it's seemingly simple, but
Mhm.
that really holds people in the capacity to be able to be with their internal experience and move through the affect, the defenses, the dissociation, et cetera. It's amazing. And um, I appreciate how you said even you missed it for years. Um,
Yeah, 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 and it's so fast, and that's why one of the principal things that people have to learn for DBR is to be able to slow down at
mm,
these critical moments of orienting to something
yeah.
traumatic, being able
Hmm.
to slow down enough to pick up the orienting tension, because that not only provides an anchor for the processing, but it opens an information file, in my view, deep
Hmm.
in the brain, deep in the
Hmm.
unconscious. For
Hmm.
example, it allows us to get into what may have been held even from very early
Yeah.
in life.
Yeah. And I think about how, with so many complex trauma clients, the conceptualization that this unhealed attachment pain is, it is an implicitly stored experience. There's not the narrative, and when we have therapies that depend on narrative and
Mm,
depend on language, when there isn't a way to express that, how do we get to that? And I think DBR is an answer for that. So with therapists who are not trained in DBR, who are like all of us did, missing the shock, would it be fair to say, even though they're missing the shock, they might still see client symptoms that are indicative of the shock that's unprocessed impacting the clients? And if that's the case, what might therapists who aren't trained in DBR therapy seeing in their clients that might be suggestive that, hey, there's shock here that's amplifying their
yeah.
symptoms? What might we say to people who are not trained in terms of, hey, this could be an indicator that this is what's happening
mhm.
for your client?
Let me back up a little,
Please.
because one of the key things that's emerged from DBR
Hmm.
is that there is this shock that comes through after the orienting tension and before the affective and the
Yes.
defensive responses. And in the 5 or 6 years or whatever it is I've been doing DBR,
Hmm. Hmm.
that has become more and more important in my view, because that shock that comes before the affect is what holds a lot of the activation.
Mm.
And if we don't pick up the shock and we don't give space, if we don't slow down enough to give space for that shock energy to dissipate, that shock energy will continue to activate and then intensify the affective responses, for example. So if people have got unhealed and untreated shock,
Mm.
one of the things I think that um, is evidence of that is emotional dysregulation, because there are intense affects. Why are there intense affects? Because there have been shocking experiences that
Hmm.
have intensified those affects.
Yeah.
If we can, if we go straight into the intense affects, we can get overwhelmed. If we slow it down, get our orienting tension,
Hmm.
find the shock, give that space, just staying with it and not rushing into the affect, then a lot of the brainstem activation dissipates, and then the affect is much less likely to be overwhelming. So one of the key indicators, I think, of unprocessed shock is affective dysregulation. And another one might be insomnia. That's often, I think, a good indicator of unprocessed shock. Another would be derealization, depersonalization, um, and there would also be somatoform experiences, I think, that would be indicative of unprocessed shock. But the main thing would be if people feel that they've done all the work on the emotional components of an
Yes.
experience, like a bereavement, for example,
Hmm.
and it's not clearing, and they're still ruminating. Rumination's another one. If they're still ruminating, then look for the shock that's been missed.
And that comment about how we can miss the shock and a conversation around what it can be symptomatic of when we see in our clients. I know for myself, from a client perspective, and then also as a therapist perspective, I started to have this experience where no matter what I did with clients with complex trauma, and dare I say, I feel very comfortable working with that population, there did become a clinical impasse at some point. Like you said, like, got to, and I wouldn't have languaged it then, but now I can now. We've been accessing the affect and getting to the defenses and maybe even treating the dissociation to some degree. And they've experienced maybe a change in their daily lives. They've had some greater capacity to increase their level of functioning in
Mhm.
between sessions. So it's not to say that those other modalities and approaches weren't helpful, because they were and continue
Yeah.
to be. But
Mhm.
it just felt we just needed to, there was just a space between where they are now and where they need to be that we couldn't jump through. And that's what I
Mhm.
think, when you say that about how it affects shock, unhealed shock contributes to symptoms, there's still that undertow that we needed to
Mhm.
get to. Uh,
Yeah. And often I think, especially with the complex trauma disorders from very
mhm.
early life, when we get to the shock, we also find that there's a core pain, often of
Mm,
aloneness,
yeah.
rejection, abandonment, humiliation, or all of these together. So we cannot rush to this, of course, because the thing about the aloneness pain, in my view, is that it's so fundamentally
Yeah.
aversive to a mammal that
Yeah.
it we find multiple ways of getting away from
Yeah.
it, so
Yeah.
we can't rush into it. But as we treat, down through the layers and layers and layers of
Hmm.
traumatic experience,
Hmm.
and we're clearing the shock and the horror, we often find that at the core there's a deep wound
Yeah.
of aloneness.
Hmm.
Nobody made to, for safety, nobody provided protection, nobody provided
Hmm.
comfort or soothing when experiences were painfully shocking.
Hmm. And the term that you utilize, aloneness pain, I think that I think about one of my clients recently that saw the cover of your text. And we happen to be in a place where she's done significant amount of work
Mm,
in other modalities. We turned to DBR, and she was describing the experience of this, the bottomless pit, the
mhm,
sense of nothingness that in
mhm,
some ways even sounds existential. It's not
mhm,
about being lonely. It's the
mhm,
core of one's essence of not being seen, heard, and felt. And I looked at the book and I said, "Is this it?" And she goes, "Yes, that's it. That's
mhm,
it." And I do see it happens over time. The language of layering really,
mhm,
it seems that people have uh, they can't help but go to that place as they've been doing that healing work. And it really is profound. People
mhm.
start to engage in their life. They start to set more boundaries. They start to be able to know. I think about clients that say, "Oh, I'm in here," have a greater embodiment.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
so that aloneness pain, I'm really glad you mentioned that, because I think in clinical practice and some modalities, we don't know that's what we need to get to with our clients. We know something's there.
yeah, yeah. And I think often when it's an experience from very early in life,
Mhm.
it's even hard for the person experiencing it to describe it in pain terms, because it's often something experienced as so aversive. I
Yeah.
don't want to stay with it. I don't want to look
Yeah.
at it. I just, I want to get away into some other
Mhm.
way of being. And
Mhm.
so we have to go back to this very gradually and
Yes.
carefully, and turning towards what has been a most aversive
Mhm.
experience from
Mhm.
very early in life.
Mhm. Mhm. And the importance of pacing with folks with complex trauma. We know that the conceptualization of that comes from many years in terms of looking at a phasic model. So you speak about, in terms of picking the activating stimuli, pacing it with clients. I always say we're not going to go for the jugular first, but
Mhm,
I've heard you even recently speak about how even within the research, there was picking something in the beginning, maybe something that was 2 weeks ago. That's
yeah,
something that is
yeah.
here, but not here. Not that it doesn't have the
Mhm.
potential to go deep, but is that still your conceptualization, that we could start with that in the beginning versus going in fast?
Yeah, I think in the
Okay.
research study that was done in London, Ontario, there was always the option of going into something recent and
Hmm.
not too activating to start with, rather
Hmm.
than aiming to go for the most severe.
Yeah.
And I think, I mean, the study in London was 8 sessions and
Hmm.
showed benefits.
Yeah.
In normal clinical practice, we'll be working for years with
Yeah.
people rather than just 8 sessions, it'll be years working. But I think this approach of using a recent stimulus that's activating
Hmm.
is one that also helps to avoid overwhelm. It allows us to get into the shock processing and then the pain and the affect, often without being overwhelmed.
Hmm.
And as we work through these, naturally there'll be memories coming back from
Yeah.
earlier in
Yeah.
life.
Yeah.
But because we are working at the deeper level, we're working at the level of the shock and pain and affect, we
Hmm.
don't need to get into the narrative
Yeah.
often of the various, unfortunately, sometimes hundreds of
Yeah.
aversive
Yeah.
experiences that some people have had.
Yeah. And I think sometimes therapists might have been trained that we need to chase the story, or
Yeah,
that we have to get in the, and again, not to be disrespectful of the client's need to express themselves and not to be dismissive, because that's not my point. But there's a balance between when going into the story becomes a way to be out of it, as
yeah.
opposed to it moving through an awareness, but still being embodied and processing at that deep level. So that might be a shift for new therapists too, as they learn DBR.
And sometimes we need to alternate sessions or space out the DBR processing
Mm,
sessions to give people a chance to discuss the narrative that they perhaps
yeah.
haven't been so aware of, or
Hmm.
to get validation of their responses,
Yeah.
or to get a different perspective, from a therapist
Yeah.
who's seeing it in a
Yeah.
very different way. So,
Yeah.
as you say, integrating DBR with, um, with what would be just, I think, good trauma therapy.
Yeah. We can't
Um,
throw that out just because we're looking at the deep brain, right? We still
yeah,
need that the capacity to support people in between. So
yeah.
so would we say DBR is still a phased model? We have the aware self and proto self, which is stabilizing. We know DBR can be stabilizing. Knowing that we can have those in between sessions, we know DBR doesn't need an accelerant. I love the language you had in the text about this doesn't need to be an accelerant,
Yeah,
but still incorporating what we do to help people maintain their day-to-day lives in between session is still okay with DBR, is what you're saying. They can still, like yoga, or they can, if there's something
yep,
they need to have a
yep,
conversation with around the therapist, or things that support their continued capacity to be with themselves.
indeed. Yeah.
Okay.
And for many people, the circumstances may still not be ideal, the circumstances in which they're living. So there may be a need at times
Yeah.
for the therapist to listen to what's happening in the
Yeah.
present and
Yeah.
to help in other ways rather than necessarily go to DBR processing
Hmm.
every session.
Hmm.
But in terms of the phase model, what's emerged here is the
Hmm.
importance of the where self.
Yes.
And for people who haven't heard this term,
Hmm.
I'll just explain
Please
that
do.
I got this idea from Greg Frishon, who'd written a book on compassion in medicine and society. And one of the ideas in this very complex book was that the the brain systems for where we
Hmm.
are separate from the brain systems for what we encounter and how we
Hmm.
respond to it. And if we think about the midbrain level, what we've been separating out are the layers of the superior colliculi that are helping us to know where our body is and to orient to what we encounter. And then the shock response or the affective response comes in from locus ceruleus or periaqueductal gray as response to what.
Hmm.
So we've been separating out those systems for awareness as much as possible from the systems for what we respond to. And of
Hmm.
course, in the human brain, over the course of its evolution, they're very integrated
Sure.
so that we can respond quickly to things in accordance with our own
Hmm.
values and personality. But the idea that the brain has systems for focusing on where we are,
Hmm.
where the body is in this moment, here, now,
Yeah.
that's proved really useful, not only as a stabilizer, but as an indicator of whether somebody can go on to
Hmm.
do DBR processing or not.
Hmm. I think one of the things that strikes me about the aware self, and did when I first learned DBR therapy, is that on presentation it can look like a stereotypical grounding experience. And one mind, this is a very oversimplified example, oh, it's 2025, and
Mm,
oh, I'm aware I'm sitting here, but it's got a very different feel when
mhm,
one actually gets in touch with that system of
mhm.
awareness versus whatness. Again, I, as usual, go to an animal concept. I think about how when an animal has a defensive response, and horses or canines being the primary that I work with. Well, let's go to horses because they're a flight animal. There's the moment, like I was saying before, where their eyes will turn, they'll have a slight, and the ear will go first. And the person who's really
Mhm,
discerning, they can notice that they're noticing before they do the flight or the
mhm,
freeze or the startle, that that moment is where
mhm.
everything happens, and they're very in tune with where they are. So I think about the research that you've written about in terms of where rats will be aware of where the exit is, in terms of when
Mhm.
a threat is there, they will be able to map where the exit is. So we need to know as a mammal where we are in order to know then what to do in order to respond on a PAG level, I would guess.
Yeah, because if we don't have a clear idea of where our
Hmm.
body is and where the potential shelter is,
Right.
then we can end up running into the lion rather than running away from it.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
So so we need to know, and the animal work shows that the animals who come out to forage have got a map of where their
Yep.
shelter is,
Yep.
and if there's a threat, then they immediately turn head and body direct to the
Yeah.
shelter, no stopping to look for signposts. It's
Yeah.
straight back to shelter. And
Yeah.
although that might seem kind of obvious, it feels to me very important in
Mm.
human terms
Yeah.
because the need for shelter, if not met in early life,
Yeah.
then doesn't have a brain correlate.
Yeah.
So that there's nowhere in the the area of the brain that's feeding into the superior colliculus
Hmm.
this information. There's nowhere that says
Hmm.
you've got shelter if you turn in this direction
Yeah.
and run, for example.
Well, and what comes to mind as we talk about that is the conceptualization of attachment shock.
Mhm,
For the infant, the caregiver is the source of shelter, and so if one is,
mhm,
um, you know, reaching and expecting, our brain being designed to try and predict and be a prediction machine. If the prediction falls and we're not held, or we're not there's not the capacity to be with, etc., that shelter, because we know that the attachment figure is the source of that shelter but
mhm.
also is a source of comfort. If that's not there, if it's unexpectedly not there, what a shock to the system. And here we go in that cycle again.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's why I think a lot of these disorganized attachment
Mm-hmm.
descriptions of how the infant behaves can be explained in terms of the midbrain systems for
Mm-hmm.
orienting to connection and
Mm-hmm.
responding with shock and horror and negative affect
Yeah.
or with positive affect.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we've talked about a series of topics related to DBR in terms of for folks who may be newer to DBR or curious about it. I wanted to kind of pivot to the DBR learner in terms of the concept of maybe speaking to people who are learning DBR, and then maybe transition to a brief conversation about animal assisted. In consulting with folks about DBR, one of the things that I see is that sometimes therapists can get really stuck almost in this cortical place, um, on the neuroanatomy. They can get overwhelmed by it. They can get
Mhm,
stuck in their experience of learning. So I'm wondering if there's this might be too esoteric, but is there some words of advice or suggestions you could give to DBR therapists about how to best walk through their learning of DBR, um, to not just take it on a cortical level, but to take it on a collicular level, uh,
mhm.
something about maybe helping them have some self-compassion with themselves as growing into being a DBR therapist? Because we don't just attend a training and get DBR. It's just not going to be that
No,
way. You can't.
no.
So what would you say to new DBR therapists who are struggling with their neuroanatomy or get overwhelmed by it all?
Mhm. I think the important thing for people new to DBR is to be able to be in the body themselves,
Mm,
to be able to be present, to know where
yeah.
they are in the moment, and to be able to do what they can to relate at that level to the person they're working with. Then to be directive, to get the sequence
Hmm.
when you orient to what happened in that
Hmm.
moment 2 weeks ago. Where is the tension?
Hmm.
Forehead around the eyes or base of skull. Let's slow it down now to see if there's shock there. You may not know what shock means, so let me give you a menu.
Menu, yeah.
In this moment, you may feel a shudder or a shiver through the body, or a coldness, a wave of heat, or an emptying or a hollowing. So just see if there's anything like that happening now that we've got the orienting tension. Then we stay with that. And the the important thing then, once we get the shock, is to give it space, to give it time, to be with it. And when therapists are new to DBR, the difficulty is often being able to give space and time to what's emerging, because many therapists have the idea that healing comes from what they do, that it's
Mm.
what they say,
Yeah. Yeah.
the interpretations, the meaning making, whatever is coming from them. And
Hmm.
in DBR, we think the healing comes from within the client. So if we set up the conditions right, we get the sequence, then the main thing is to keep it slow, to
Yeah.
be with rather than to do. So
Hmm.
let's be with that shock. Notice the once it dissipates a little, notice the feelings that are coming in now, and then being human in responses to them.
Yeah.
Not just saying yes, stay with that. Just acknowledging
Hmm.
this made you feel very angry or sad or afraid or whatever.
Hmm.
So just being with the person's
Yeah.
process
Yeah.
rather than trying to drive it in some way.
Mm. I like that phrase, drive it, because um, the capacity to be present with, or that collicular presence, as you talk about, is the foundation. Um, so I would say, even for therapists, to make sure they're engaging and have their own where self
Yeah,
connected. Have they
yeah.
experienced that before they even walk in between clients? I mean, what's good for clients is good for us. We are no different than them.
Mhm.
Um, and my sense is, even that presencing, um, our clients can feel when we're not present. It's
Mhm.
not what we say. It's the,
Mhm.
again, it might sound esoteric. There's an energetic feel about when someone is
Yeah,
present or not, right?
yeah.
Or if it's mechanical, DBR, anything therapy can be kind of mechanical.
Mm.
And even the tone, the intonation we use, the way that we presence, their deep brain's going to pick that up anyway, right? Who are we
Mhm.
fooling? We're not fooling their deep brain if we're not
Mm.
with ourselves. So,
And we'll often get it wrong, is the other
mm.
thing for
Yeah, yeah, the
people
ego
to
doesn't like
remember.
that.
We
Yeah,
because if we're working with somebody who's been neglected in infancy, then if we're silent, our silence may be felt as an angry rejection because that's what they experienced in infancy.
yeah,
If we say things, they may feel misattuned because it doesn't quite
doesn't
get it
match.
right. So,
Yeah,
so we'll often get it wrong, but we do our best to get it right,
yeah,
to be there and be with the
yeah,
process and allow
yeah.
the process to flow, and we accept the feedback. you're saying too much, you're saying too little, the
Hmm.
tone of voice isn't quite right, you know,
Right.
whatever it is that
Yeah.
we need to modify.
Yeah.
But you know, that's part of being with the person,
Yeah.
is doing this deep level processing
Hmm.
and giving it a chance to follow its own pathway.
I think the thing that I've been curious about, not I don't even know if this is answerable, but I've seen, I don't know if it's a pattern, but just I get the sense sometimes that when I'm watching the human animal in front of me and doing DBR therapy, and that's where my brain tends to default to, is the human animal, just because of the animal assisted work, that there can be sometimes a commonality in terms of, let's say we're within in Panskep's works, in terms of maybe we're in a rage system,
Mhm,
and there might be a sneer, there might be a snarl, there might be, and I think about the dogs I work with, I think about what I see in terms of the coyotes that I've seen around my property line, things like that. There, I don't know if we can say there's a universality about it, but I know Darwin used to talk about that in
mhm,
terms of the connection between man and animal in terms of their expressions of emotions. He called it the neuroanatomy of emotion. And granted, his
mhm,
work was very Eurocentric, mind you, but
mhm,
the human as animal, I think that's one of my favorite things about DBR therapy is, again, not to minimize the human experience of the client,
mhm,
but I think that helps to be able to see the brain sequence and then just have a conceptualization of what am I seeing here in terms of the human animal.
mhm.
And then it actually takes the interpretation out of it because you're watching the movements, you're maybe you're seeing the sneers, you're seeing how that's reflected in the work, and the body just expresses what it needs to express as an organism.
Because we're trying to get the sense of it at that
Hmm.
level of the responses that are basic to mammals. For you know, all these
Yeah.
affective systems are common to all mammals, according to Panksepp,
Yeah.
as you mentioned. So
Yeah.
we're trying to be at that level here now, monitoring any
Hmm.
affective and defensive responses
Hmm.
without trying to do anything with them, to
Yeah.
be with them, to give them a chance to clear.
I think about one of the cases that you and I have chatted briefly about, where I had a client, and a lot of my DBR work, when it's not hot as anything in Arizona, can be done outside working with the horses, or inside I'm working with a dog. But this equine example is, this client and I were outside and she started to move into this ventrolateral PAG. The opioid started to kick in. She still had the orienting tension, and I just happened to invite her to look at the horse that was in front of her. And it happened to be that this mare also had a tendency to collapse when standing. She wasn't restful. Long, boring story, but she's never laid down to completely rest. She's always on guard of the whole
Mhm,
herd. And she was standing and she was collapsing. And it was this
mhm,
amazing parallel of the client looking at the horse going, that's what's going on in here,
mhm,
that's that. And the capacity for her to be able to be with that, the opioids coming in, and then to shift through it. And then at the end of session, another horse came through. The client had a sense of a threat to her right side. And one of my mares came through on the right hand side. And the client said, oh, she's telling me that threat's not there anymore. And I still get goosebumps when I think about it.
mhm,
So, from
mhm.
a neuroanatomical perspective, what might have been happening there when she's getting a new perspective? She's mapping her internal and external world differently. When that horse came through, is that helping her brain? Is that at a collicular level helping her to sense there's a different space around her? I don't even know what I'm
Def-
asking, but I'm curious about it.
yeah, definitely at the curricular level, I think, because you've got your horses well trained and they come in just at the right time and in
I'm
the
not
right
that good, Frank.
place. But it's nice when it happens like that,
Yeah,
isn't it?
yeah,
And
organically,
you
yeah,
know, the colliculus is registering a threat
yeah,
on the right, and
yeah.
then the horse appears from that direction,
Hmm.
and it's a non-threatening approach. So you've
Good.
got the immediate displacement of the threat vigilance by sense of connection, and um, that I think the idea of shelter probably comes
Okay.
into contact with animals too. I haven't any experience of the equine-assisted work, unfortunately, but
That's okay.
I'm guessing from experience of dogs
Yeah.
that often there would be a sense of shelter
Yeah.
when you orient, for example, to a dog that you have a good connection with.
Yeah.
There would be that sense of shelter, and that would, I think, be coming at the curricular level and bringing in some of those higher brain elements also.
It's interesting you say that because it's very common when I'm inside and I have a dog in session. And keep in mind, dog is presence, not interrupting the process per
Mhm,
se, but just there's kind of an organic flow that happens, like you said. I've had quite a few clients where, from a dissociation perspective, in terms of that composite model of dissociation that you speak about with DBR, where the client has actually got a part that's kicked in and then the client has been popped out of the orienting tension, and we've had to really, of course, you've heard me use this phrase a lot, not rummaging around in the parts, but
mm,
asking the awareness of the part to actually bring an awareness to the aware self. And so yesterday this happened, actually, since I emailed you about our conversation today. I had a client where I tried to bring in an awareness of the sense of where the client was seated in relation to where the dog was, and
mhm,
it didn't work.
mm,
I thought, okay, that's interesting. And so the client had language that the part was actually coming through as an internal sound. And so my conceptualization was, okay, what if I work with sound as a way to get that curricular level of presence in response to the sound being what is disruptive for the client with the part? So then I asked the client to actually sense where the dog was breathing. Could you hear the sound of the
mhm,
dog breathing? Because he was actually napping at that time. I have a
mhm,
5-month-old puppy. That is a very exciting thing when a dog is napping.
mhm,
So the sound of him breathing and asking the part to bring that in as an awareness of the aware self, and that's what got it. So I'm
mhm.
curious, again, from a neuroanatomical perspective. Yes, the aware self, in terms of with that as an example client, we could try the distance between animal and client, but it didn't work. But the
Mhm,
sound did while the
mhm.
part was activated in sound. Does that fit? Did we get to a different layer of the superior colliculi with that?
Yeah, just slightly deeper layer of the superior
Okay.
colliculus, because orienting to sound also involves the superior colliculus.
Hmm.
So that was a great idea. Orienting to the dog's breathing then brings
Hmm.
in the the intermediate layer of the superior colliculus, and helps to establish the awareness and nowness from which the
Hmm.
part can be seen as
Hmm.
an upper level
Hmm.
phenomenon, really.
Yeah,
And of course, we're not disputing the existence of parts, we're not
certainly.
denying that they're there, but as much as possible, we're working below the level of the parts
Yeah.
with with the where self, and the where self turning towards an activating stimulus. Perhaps a
Hmm.
part might be the activating stimulus. Um, but we're always trying to work from where self level to
Yeah.
make sure there's always that sense of here-ness and nowness
Mm.
while processing.
And it strikes me sometimes is how the attachment related conflicts can come in when they encounter or interact with an animal for the first time. So in the animal assisted world, it's not unusual for people to hear very often, actually, oh, the horse doesn't like me, or
Uh-huh.
oh, I want to touch the dog, but I'm afraid to. I think about one of my clients recently, I'm afraid to touch him because it might hurt him. And
Yeah,
it echoes that conflict
yeah,
about the attachments, the draw to and the pull back at the same
yeah,
time. And I have in some cases utilized that as the activating stimulus, and it's been really
absolutely.
profound.
Yeah, I was just thinking that
Yeah.
let's get an orienting tension for
Yeah.
that. The horse doesn't like me,
Yeah.
or let's get an orienting tension for I can't approach the dog because I'll
Hmm.
do damage, and
Yeah.
then we'll process from there.
Yeah.
Yep, great ways into
Oh, good.
underlying
Good to hear.
attachment conflicts.
Yeah. Yeah. And in the animalist, and I know we're going to close out in a couple minutes in terms of time, but I know in the animal assisted field, there's technically not something called animal assisted therapy. The therapeutic model one uses is supposed to drive the animal assisted interaction. So when I think about what I'm starting to language as animal assisted interweaves, that we're still maintaining the integrity of DBR therapy. We're not, again, that great language of an accelerant. We're not trying to use an accelerant,
Mm,
but we're looking at the activating stimuli related to the animal. There's so many people who are doing work with DBR online with their pets are coming in, and it's a missed
mhm,
opportunity
yeah.
for
Mhm,
therapists to work with these animals in partnership
mm,
in these really simple ways that could be really
mm.
profound. So I'm really grateful we could have that conversation about that, because you know me well enough that I get sparked by that and could talk about that all day. So, well, Frank, I'm really grateful for the time you took with me. As always, it's so lovely to chat with you, and I hope that just a reminder that you have ongoing therapy trainings available, level 1, 2, and 3. You actually have a level 3 coming up in January. So for those who
Mm.
are DBR trained, if there's still space, this is a great time to get training and extensive training and working with complex trauma and dissociation. And of course, your new text. So hopefully people will look that up as well. So,
Yeah, and thank you, Sarah, for giving me the opportunity to be
yeah.
here and to talk about DBR. And I hope it's been helpful for some of those folk that'll be watching the recording.
Yeah, I'm sure it will be. Thank you so much.